Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program, we've talked many times about how people suffer from anxiety, and most of us probably do at one time or another feeling anxious, especially in today's world with so much noise filling our world. The question is, what do we do about that? Well, most of us kind of go through our day realizing, well, this is just something we have to deal with and kind of get through it. But others, on the other hand, have something that becomes very obsessive, especially when it comes to worry, physical symptoms such as tightness in the chest, contagious diseases, things that are just kind of bothering us that we think there is no end in sight. On our program today is somebody who shares a very radical new approach for letting go of fear and finding lasting peace. She is someone who is an ongoing student in A Course of Miracles, and she's sharing with us today her newest book, From Anxiety to Love. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today counselor, coach, professor, and mindfulness instructor, Corinne Zucco. Corinne, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Well, it's good to feel excited versus anxious, isn't it?
Sure, definitely.
Let's talk about what's going on now. Was this something that's been going on pretty much all your life, or what happened here?
For the most part, I come from a family that has anxiety, an anxiety history. So you could say I was primed when I was born to struggle with anxiety. And when I was young, when I was about 2, I actually got my first psychiatric diagnosis of separation anxiety disorder from my mother. I was a difficult child in that my poor mom, even if she walked out of the room that I was in our very own house, I would scream my head off if she left my sight. So that was sort of the first indication that I was probably going to have lifelong issues with anxiety, because from there, although I outgrew the separation anxiety, it sort of morphed and changed and came out in different ways. So I became phobic of different things as a child. As I grew older, the anxiety started coming out as panic attacks and uncontrollable worry. So it really became a lifelong teacher for me, although now I'm living very anxiety-free, and, that's why I share and wrote the book that I wrote, and feel so dedicated to teaching the skills that have helped me to other people.
Now, I was really pretty, I guess, call it animated about how you gave the idea about our thoughts in relation to golden geese, especially in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Let's talk about that a little bit, because I found that funny, because the way that we judge our thoughts and the way we think about ourselves, and if we can start to realize that we have our own little inner therapist, that's the first step toward liberation, I would think.
It is. So I'm so glad you brought up this example from Willy Wonka. I have some movie references sort of sprinkled throughout the book because I grew up watching this film. And when you think about those golden geese, and I'm talking the original Willy Wonka from, the 70s,
right.
Those golden geese would lay golden eggs, and they would go down to this savvy scale that judged that egg to be either good, to be shipped out all over the world, or bad, to be tossed down the trash chute. And I liken this to our thinking. We are birthing thoughts. We're having thoughts all the time. And the problem that we get into is that we often take our thoughts, no matter what they are, as true, even if they are really judgmental thoughts or really negative thoughts, or just thoughts that are just, not actually true whatsoever. They're true for us. And so we hang on to them. We breathe life into them. We make them very, very real for ourselves. So this example with the movie of Willy Wonka, I like to think about how we are, I truly believe, love at our core. And when we birth thoughts of love, those are the good eggs. Those are the thoughts that are worthy of extending and being expressed. The other thoughts that we have, which occupy probably most of our mind most of the time, don't serve us so well. And there is, you referenced our inner therapist, there is a part of our own mind that remembers the love that we are. And it's this part that we can turn to, that we can bring our yucky thoughts to, and we can say, hey, clean this thought up for me. Give me a miracle instead. Give me a shift in perception instead. So none of our thoughts actually go down the trash chute, but instead I like to think about it as an exchange. We exchange our judgmental thoughts, our fearful thoughts. We exchange those for what can be a shift, a renewed sense of peace and light and love, because, again, I truly believe that's who we are.
You know, and it's so totally true how we really identify ourselves with our thoughts. And a perfect example is how people, for instance, feel about the kind of work they do in the world. And it can be anything from pride to shame, depending on how you want to look at it. But the fact is, as I would share with people, if you could simply take a look at what you do in the present moment. Let's just say, you could be a janitor, and most people might think of you, according to your own thinking, that a janitor is one of them beneath the world unworthy jobs that just needs to be done. But the fact is you actually put order to the chaos that others have created. And if you can also look at yourself as a professional, as somebody who puts order to the chaos that others have created, that you realize it's because you do this that they have any kind of order in their lives at all, you'll take a look at the kind of work you do in a whole new way. So just like you were saying, it's a matter of shifting and taking a look at what is that golden egg I'm laying, as you were saying in reference to your book, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, and making a different decision than the one you've been making before.
Absolutely. And those jobs, all jobs, we all have an essential role to play, even if it doesn't seem like it. We might be in a job maybe that doesn't quite fulfill us, but we can still bring love into everything that we do. We still have opportunities in every interaction with other people to express compassion, to express this kindness. And I'd love to actually pick up on what you just said about identifying how much we identify with our thoughts, because if you think about it, language is so powerful. And if I say, I am anxious, or I am depressed, or I am sad, or whatever it is, that's very different. We're fused with those feelings. That is our identity. I am fill in the blank. But if we can shift our language into, I am noticing anxiety, or I am noticing depression, or I'm noticing sadness, we now become just one step removed from that temporary passing state, that mind state or that feeling. We are that awareness that can notice those feelings coming up. So that's not that we don't feel our feelings, we certainly do, but that languaging is really, really important.
Now, Corinne, because you have, it sounds to me, and also from what I was reading in your book, From Anxiety to Love, is that this seemed to be a learned behavior. Is that true?
That's a good question. Maybe a little bit, because I can remember as a child, we were going through some financial stressors, and I remember my dad being really nervous and anxious about it, and I definitely picked up on that. But it was more, so some of it maybe was learned, but I would say for the most part, I don't really look at it that way. I look at it more as this actually ended up being a gift in my life to bring me to an even greater peace than I could previously comprehend. So I tend to think of it more as just, this is part of my journey, my life lesson, and anxiety was with me to teach me, to become my teacher instead of my adversary.
So now I know that A Course in Miracles seemed to be extremely valuable in your life. Tell us why that is. When did this start for you?
That's a great question. So I was introduced to A Course in Miracles by my mom when I started suffering from panic attacks. Before that, I was not open to any of this woo-woo stuff. I was not interested in any of this spiritual stuff. But my anxiety was very existential. I wrestled with questions like, why are we here? What is the point of all this? And, if they say that, like, God and the universe is love, well, I don't really see, of course I see loving things, but turn on the news and it feels like it's anything but love. Like, how can this all just be? And so what I needed, although counseling definitely helped me to a point, the remedy that I needed was spiritual. I needed a completely new way of looking at the world and of interacting with the world. And it was A Course in Miracles, this metaphysical text that is available anywhere. It's just a book. It's a self-study system of really, it's psycho-spiritual. It works with our thinking, and it also helps us develop a sense of trust and a sense of love, that is what we are. It helps us remember that truth about ourselves. So A Course in Miracles was critical for me in healing, probably above anything else, because it was the only pathway that I had studied that really felt like it helped me get deep into my mind to exhume those deep fears for healing. So it played a very key role for me.
Now, I understand that it was a few years back that you had a surgery that you had, and that was something that was really kind of rough for you, but it was also liberating at the same time.
Yeah. So health concerns were always my biggest anxiety trigger. The tiniest little physical symptom, and I'd be like, oh my gosh, what is that? I better go get it checked out. I very much had those sort of hypochondria, tendencies to just really, really be worried about bodily concerns. And I found myself in a situation where one inconclusive test led to another, and then some incidental findings found that I needed a surgical procedure. And what was liberating about this was that I had been working with my inner therapist through this whole journey. Even though I felt nervous and scared, I said, help me. I want to experience a miracle. I want to experience that. And when I say miracle, I mean a shift in perception from fear to love. I want to let this surgery be used to help me remember love instead of forget it. And what happened was that my mom, who's also a student of A Course in Miracles, she was also working the same process. And it was 5 o'clock on a particular day when I got a phone call, a voicemail from the doctor saying that the biopsy results came back fine. And of course I felt a lot of relief. But unbeknownst to my mother, that I had gotten this news, she had no idea. Within a minute of me getting that phone call, she had experienced this feeling of like sandbags being lifted off of her shoulders. And she wasn't worried about me. She trusted that everything was going to be okay, but she was engaged in this work with there's really only one inner therapist, but with her inner therapist, asking again for an experience of a miracle. And what happened with her was that she gets cluster headaches. And her headache it felt like sandbags were being lifted off of her shoulders, and her headache evaporated and did not come back for weeks, which was very, very unheard of. That was just never her typical experience. And it happened within that minute of me getting the phone call. And so that, to me, was a teaching situation that showed me A Course in Miracles teaching of when you are healed, you're not healed alone. Healing happens at the level of the mind. As we remember our truth about ourselves, that is what heals us. That is what makes, the physical less important almost as we learn how to heal our mind. So it was in that mind healing moment that both she and I had experienced, this positive reduction for her of symptoms, and for me, some good news. So that was a profound experience for me that I read about in the book.
Now, I was rather entertained to discover that you were a fan of a particular show that I was very much myself. In fact, I consider it my personal favorite cartoon of all time. That was the Ren and Stimpy show. And you gave a funny example, for instance, of Space Madness, which is actually one of the funnier, they're all pretty funny. I was a fan of the first 2 seasons. By the 3rd season, I didn't think it was so much, but how Stimpy was put in charge of what was called the history eraser button. And it's funny because sometimes I'll come across people, they're working on a computer, and they look like they're about to push the button, and then I'll step in and I'll actually do that little bit, Will he push the button that could erase their very existence, sort of a thing. But the fact is that we go around each and every day realizing those buttons may or may not be pushed, that could or could not erase our very existence as we know it.
I love that. I love that. And I love that you picked up on that. That Ren and Stimpy episode is one of my favorites.
But let's talk about that, the big red button here and the way you looked at it from that. And it was funny that you were a fan as well. So. Yeah,
definitely. So I like to think that compelling button that he just wants to press so badly, to erase everything and start over, is like a giant reset button, right? It's just like it resets everything. We're starting over from scratch. There is a prayer, little paragraph in A Course in Miracles that, to me, is that same type of reset button. No matter how messed up I might feel in my mind with fear or worry or struggle, when I go to this prayer, it helps me reset my mind. So the prayer goes, and it's a little bit lengthy, but I'll break it down as best I can. I must have decided wrongly because I am not at peace. I made the decision myself, but I can also decide otherwise. I want to decide otherwise because I want to be at peace, and I don't feel guilty because the Holy Spirit, which is your inner therapist, will undo all the consequences of my wrong decision if I will let her or him, whatever you want to think about it. So I choose to let her by allowing her to decide for God or for love for me. Now, this prayer is taking us into a recognition that somewhere I made a choice for fear. It's putting me back in that seat of responsibility that I don't know when or where or how I made this choice for fear, but I did. And so I'm accepting responsibility for that. But I'm not going to feel guilty about it, and I'm not going to get tripped up by it, because this part of my right mind, which I call your inner therapist, which again is the part of our mind that remembers love, this part knows the way out. It will undo all of my mistaken thoughts, anything, all the consequences of my mistakes. It'll be undone in a moment. And so I can just allow that part of my mind to step in and take the wheel instead of the fear voice in my mind, which is usually the thing that's steering our ships. It's what was steering my ship into the ground. And so putting this other part of our mind, of our own mind, in charge enables us to open our minds for this experience of miracles, which again are shifts in perception and expressions of love. So I love that red button reset prayer in the Course in Miracles, that we need not worry or feel concerned. We can just, let it all be undone in an instant.
I'm reminded some years back we had guest Byron Katie on our program. And she was the one who was well known for writing a book, Loving What Is, 4 Questions That'll Change Your Life. And, the simplicity, first of all, of her inquiry is one of those great things that, someone has put out there, much like what you've done, from anxiety to love. The simplicity of what we're talking about here is pay attention to what your thought is screaming out at you that's causing you the physical manifestation that you're experiencing. And keeping it simple, let's say right from now, maybe the listeners are thinking, well, what does that mean to me? And okay, well, let's show you what this means to you. Let's do something simple. For instance, we all can tend to, at one point or another, when things don't feel like they're working out well in life, tend to compare ourselves with someone else who seems happier. They seem to have a better job. They seem to make more money. They seem to have a better place that they live. They seem to have better friends. They seem to have everything I don't have. Tell us how you were able to deal with something like that.
Great question. There's a quote from one of the Roosevelts, I forget who, that is, comparison is the thief of joy. Comparison is the thief of joy. The moment that we fall into that comparison trap is that moment that we're back into that fearful part of our mind. We've just slipped into that fear, and we've forgotten, again, our inherent worthiness. There's another part of A Course in Miracles that shares that nothing that you can do or think or wish or make establishes your worth. So nothing we can do establishes our worth. Our worth is already established by our source, by love, by the universe. So if we can drop into that and recognize that comparing ourselves to another is just that voice of fear, that I'm already exactly where I need to be for my own growth and learning, and that who I am is worthy just for being me, that can help us step out of this comparison trap. So I like to, with any challenge, with any thing that comes up like this, I work a 3-step process. And it's going to sound really simple, maybe too simple, and that's why I do break it down further in my book, because the ego likes complexity, and truth is simple. But this 3-step process that I would use in a situation like this is to find my willingness to see my issue differently. So if I am just stuck in feeling really crappy because I've compared myself to somebody, am I willing to feel differently? Heck yes. Absolutely. I can talk about what to do if you're not willing, but I'll come back to that in a moment. The next step is to turn to this part of your mind, your inner therapist, and say, hey, I'm willing to see this differently. Take this from me and give me the miracle instead. So you're exchanging your perception for a shift, for a miracle. And the third step being to trust that you handed it over, you've asked for that shift. And, of course, Miracles teaches that the answer is given the moment that we ask. So if I'm not aware of the shift yet, it's because I still maybe have some layers of fear that are there in the way. But I can trust that the answer has been given, and I'm going to maybe get quiet, maybe sit and do a breathing meditation, or even just take a few deep breaths. Anything to just create some space to let a new thought come within. So that's how I would work that experience if I was stuck in the comparison trap, or that's the exact process that I just described of how I worked with anxiety, so it can be applied to anything. I should just mention, because I referenced that question, am I willing to see differently? If we're honest, and this healing process requires radical honesty, if we are honest, there might be times when we're not willing to see differently. For instance, if you're in a relationship conflict, and are you willing to see it differently? No, they're being a jerk. I'm right, they're wrong. That's the type of honesty we need. It can be really helpful to recognize that you can ask yourself, am I willing to be willing to see this differently? And there you might find your tiny speck of willingness. You're not willing to see it differently, but you're willing to be willing. And so great. So we can now work with that willingness and go through those 3 steps. So I hope that makes sense.
Well, absolutely. See, and you're doing something and you're suggesting to take a step that most of us don't. Many times when it comes to especially anxious thoughts, let's just use one example of a feeling that you're not worthy of something. You're not really measuring up could be one of those things. And you end up following that thought in a way of inquiry that simply states the idea that this is you, okay, rather than questioning, for instance, as I brought up Byron Katie, but is this really true? Or how do you know this is true? Or what evidence do you have that what you're thinking right now is true? Mm-hmm. And it's funny how different it is in your state of mind when you shift gears instead of thinking, I'm really unworthy, and then pretty soon the other thoughts that follow are all those thoughts that actually basically support this first thought. I'm this because, my boss the other day told me that I was doing this, or, my boyfriend, for instance, doesn't think that I'm loving enough. And you follow that train of thought as though it's real, but the fact is it's just a thought. Yeah. And if you were to turn around on that thought, for instance, I'm not feeling very loved by my boyfriend, for instance, or girlfriend, you can simply say, really, what evidence do you have that this is true? And just that simple idea alone, just doing that, really shifts everything, doesn't it?
It really does. I love those questions from Byron Katie, and that recognition that our thoughts are just thoughts. We get so stuck in our thoughts as reality. We need to find that little bit of space from them. And one of the liberating quotes that, and I don't know who first said this, but I always found this quote so liberating. You don't have to believe everything that you think. In other words, we can question even our own thoughts, just like you're saying with these questions from Byron Katie, or this 3-step process with, being willing to see our thoughts differently. There's many ways that we can come at this, but we tend to get so fixated that how we see, that our perception is correct. There's scientific studies that show that, we in our perception, it's faulty. We miss a lot of detail. We don't take in the whole big picture. This is science. This is not just, spirituality. And so if we can embrace that, rather than thinking that I know, if we can say, oh, whatever it is, I don't have the whole picture. I don't know. That space of I don't know can, again, make room for big shifts and for experiences of love to come in and new solutions that we weren't even thinking of before. Nobel laureates often come, I learned this from one of my teachers, Nobel laureates have often reported that their big ideas have come to them in the silence of the night. Not when they're in that thinking mind. Those big ideas come in that space instead. So that space of I don't know can be really helpful.
Fascinating. How have you seen people actually change as you've been able to kind of help penetrate into their world and make those changes they were looking for?
I've seen people change because many of them, the ones who have made the biggest changes, were just tired of the old way. They've kind of had it with the old way of thinking, and they're open and they're willing to do this work. And so many people, and this isn't even just people that I've worked with, this is other students of A Course in Miracles that I've come into contact with, other writers that are out there. Many people have experienced profound shifts and healing of issues just falling away from doing this work. It can feel like we have 1,000,001 things that we need to work on and 1,000,001 things that we need to solve. But what I love about this pathway of A Course in Miracles is that it says there's really only one belief that needs healing, and that is the belief that we are separate from love, that we're separate from each other. When that belief goes, all the other beliefs, and all the other false perceptions in our mind fall away. Now, I don't know anybody who's there or there consistently, but that has always given me so much hope that this actually doesn't have to be as hard as we think it is. So we can, engage with this work, give it our best, and just stay open. And it's through, again, that willingness. The folks who've had the biggest changes have had that willingness to experience these shifts and to do it differently and experience those healings.
Fascinating. It's wonderful to know people like you go out with this work and you realize that it's because you have had, maybe call this, stigmatism, if you will, that actually changed your life because it became a gift in such a way as you've seen it, that you were actually out there to help others to do the same.
Yeah, thank you. I really feel so passionate that humanity is ready for something new. We're ready for a shift. Our old ways of functioning, our old methods, it's not working anymore. And those of us who want to hang on to how things, were and want to recreate that, that can create some friction and some struggle. And we do this in our own minds all the time with ourselves. Like, I should feel like I used to feel, or I should do what I used to do. I was happy then. But we only have this moment. And it's this moment where we always have the power to choose. Am I going to choose love, or am I going to choose to come out of fear?
Now, where can people find out more about your work?
I am, of course, on social media. My handle is, Corinne Zupko, but the easiest way to find me is probably through my website, which is the same title as my book, which is FromAnxietyToLove.com.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Now, I was going to say, as we were talking earlier about the comparison trap, let's talk about how we can use that to help us heal.
We can use the comparison trap to help us heal we can use any challenge to help us heal as we repurpose it. So what I mean by that is that if we go back to this idea that we have two thought systems in our mind, a fearful thought system and a loving thought system, the fearful thought system will use all of our negative experiences to prove that, yes, we are limited to just being bodies. Yes, we are separate from each other. Yes, we're separate from love. That thought system, that's that sort of purpose of that thought system, is to let our experiences teach us of our separation. This other way is about repurposing the comparison trap or repurposing our anxiety or whatever it may be. We say instead to this, again, loving thought system in our mind, take this from me and look upon it, judging it for me. That's a Course quote. Take this from me and look upon it, judging it for me. In other words, I want to give you my challenge because I want it to be used to help me wake up instead of me staying asleep. So the experience then, what we're essentially asking is to have an experience that teaches us of our wholeness instead of our separation. And I can, if we have time, I can share a specific example.
Absolutely, please.
There was a time when I was at a doctor's office because I was concerned about a physical symptom that I had, and this is a symptom that I had my whole life. So I was in this doctor's office, and the nurse was drawing blood, and she asked me why I was there, and I said, oh, I'm here because of, this, this, and that. And she's like, oh, that's not good. And I was like, well, it's a symptom I've had my whole life. And she goes, well, that's not good. And then she looks at me, and she goes, don't you pass out on me. And guess what I did? I got really scared. I had that rush of fear, and I had that pass-out response happen right there in the doctor's office. She had to put my legs up and, help me to sit back and give me apple juice and gummy worms to bring my blood sugar back up. And I could easily have gone into a place of, what a lousy nurse, how insensitive for her to say things like that, especially to someone like me who's so hyper-attuned to, fearful things and body stuff. So instead, I chose to look at that situation that in some way I called forth an experience of fear, and she rose to the occasion and agreed to play that role to help solidify my fear. So I looked at it instead as I'm kind of the one in charge here. Rather than be the passive, victim of this circumstance, I don't know how I played some sort of active part in this, but I was fearful, and so I saw fear. That's probably the simplest way that I can say it. The doctor then, in that same appointment, was like, oh, you need to go get some more blood work, but this time you have to go to a hospital to do it because it's like a, more complicated test. At that point in time, I hated needles, but I hated hospitals even more. So I was terrified to have to go into the hospital to get this lab work done, and I was very scared. But I said to myself, okay, I don't want a repeat of what just happened. I want to see witnesses for love instead. I want to repurpose my need to have to go get this test. Rather than it be, again, to strengthen fear, I want to repurpose this situation so it can show me witnesses for love. So I got to the hospital, I walked into the outpatient clinic, and I had no idea that the mom of a college suite-mate was there. She was sitting behind the desk working in this outpatient lab, this, outpatient wing of the hospital. And we started chatting, and I didn't even know she was a nurse. So she ended up, without my asking, walking me back and doing the lab work herself, drawing the blood, and it was totally fine. We chatted the whole time, no big deal. But the biggest thing was that she said something to me that stopped me in my tracks when I was leaving. And it was a Monday. She said, Corinne, she's like, it's amazing, that you were here today. She said, I never work on Mondays, but I got called in 30 minutes before you showed up. And I still get goosebumps when I share that story because that, to me, was an experience of repurposing a situation, whatever that situation may be that we're in, whether it's a comparison trap or something like this. I wanted it to be used to allow me to see witnesses for love instead of witnesses for fear. And that was exactly what happened in that circumstance. So that was one of my very foundational trust-building experiences that this process that I talk about in my book works, because it helps remove the layers of fear that are in the way of what's beneath it, which is love's presence. So we're now, as we remove these layers of fear, we're becoming aware that we're not alone, that love is with us, that love is who we are.
Now, you also talk about, and I was really interested in having you share this with our listeners, is that when you're in the state of love, like you're just talking about here, we're not talking about like relationship love, but in the state of love itself, the energy of love, that the ego tends to scream louder. First of all, describe what is the ego in relation to your world, and what is it doing there in that example?
So in the context of coming from A Course in Miracles and what I write about in my book, the ego is our fearful thought system. It's the thought system that tells us that we are separate bodies, that this is all that there is, that it's judgmental, it's harsh. It's that voice in our minds that we know very well because it's based on fear, and most of us walk around daily with this voice in our minds. The ego part of our mind is there to convince us of our separation. And when we start to turn to love instead, sometimes that part can kick up a little bit. So it can, in my experience, I maybe start to feel anxiety for no reason, and I'd be like, what is this going on? And I would look at it as, oh, it's just part of my mind that is afraid of love, because I could even say that the ego thinks that if we start paying attention to love that we're going to just totally, forget about it. And it gets scared. There's part of our mind that gets scared that we could be asked to sacrifice something, or that we're going to lose something, or that we're going to be different in some way. And yet, the only thing that we actually do lose as we turn to love more and more is fear. And when we step into that and have these experiences of miracles and of shifts, I've had the moment of saying, why did I ever defend against this? This feels really, really good. So that fearful voice, that ego thought system in our mind can kick up sometimes, but I like to look at it as a sign that we're making progress. So there's never any setback. It's only opportunities for healing. And if it seems like things are getting more intense, it just means that we're making progress. And that's just a reframe that's really been helpful to me.
Yeah, it certainly is true. I remember even going through a situation many years ago where I found myself in it was pretty rough out there financially, and it seemed that I was about to be evicted from a place that I was renting, and it was an experience I never had before. And I remember finally one day I was given a 72-hour notice, to come up with a certain amount of money. I thought, well, how is this going to happen? Of course, you're following that train of thought, and that train of thought leads you down a roadway that always paints all the worst-case scenarios. Oh, I may be homeless. This has never happened before, my credit or whatever, just one thing after another. Finally, one day I was sitting on the porch of a bookstore that was up in northwest Portland. And I keep remembering this day because it was so liberating. As I sat there on the porch, it was a beautiful day outside, going into the evening. And I thought to myself, okay, well, let's just go ahead and follow this. If you're out there and you're homeless, like you seem to believe you're going to be, would that be okay with you? Would you be able to live through something like that? As soon as I asked that question, it all changed. And it didn't really matter to me then. I said, well, you've been homeless before. In other words, between homes. You seemed to come out of that okay, didn't you? And then all of a sudden the train of thought changed. And I realized, there were times that I didn't have what I had now, but I was able to get what I had then. And I realized, well, if I could do this like I did before, why couldn't I do it again? Then all of a sudden, by that day, I had received everything I needed to. You could call it miracles if you will, but it's like you said, it's a shift in perception, a shift in thought, and you begin to see things you didn't see when your way of thinking was the way it was in the other state.
That is a beautiful story. and so powerful to just illustrate everything that we've been talking about, that when we can change our thinking and actually, like you, in my own words, we can remind ourselves that, like, okay, well, what's the worst that can happen here? And yeah, I can be okay. Like, I can find my way through that. I've done things like this before. And how quickly then that train of thought can just stop in its tracks. So that's a really powerful experience.
Well, that's what we're all about here, Corinne. We're sharing powerful experiences because yours have certainly been very powerful, haven't they?
They have, for sure.
If you were to go back to the person you were, say, 5 years ago, what would you then say to that person? And do you think that person would actually receive and be able to take that and run?
That's a wonderful question. And I would say that person back then, maybe even a little bit longer than 5 years, would have been desperately open to hearing that she's going to be okay. The assurance that it's okay, that there's a bigger picture here, and that you're going to find your way through, you're going to make it, you're going to be okay. I would have eaten that up back then and found a lot of comfort in that. And I really want to offer that to other folks listening, that no matter what it is that you're going through, love, and I'm talking, like you said, it's not the relationship love, it's the love of the universe. That is what you are. That is what you are made of, regardless of how you think about yourself and what thoughts might trip you up. And so that moment that we can just step into that awareness, that is who we are, that is what we are, the rest of it can shift. It can fall away. It can truly, truly fall away. So we're going to make it.
Absolutely. I was just thinking, because you love using movie references, I've done that many times on this program, kind of help listeners kind of put things in perspective. And I think one of the most powerful scenes in a movie that I've seen is from the Academy Award-winning film Rocky. Now, I don't know of anybody out there who hasn't seen Rocky at least once. And it wasn't until years later that I had seen it again, and I guess it was that point in life where you begin to notice things you didn't notice before. But there's a scene in there where he is in this sort of call it a dive-in apartment that he lives in. And he's simply standing in front of the mirror. There's a picture, and it's the actual picture of him when he was a little boy. Kind of one of them little school pictures you take on photo day. And he's looking at this picture, and you're realizing the point that he's at in his life. I mean, this is before the challenge from the world champion even comes across his way. He's just a two-bit ham and egger fighter, as he calls himself. And I thought it was so powerful because he pulls the picture from the mirror and he's looking at it, and you know what's probably going on in his mind, but it was neat how powerful it was for a viewer like me to pick up on the idea that if the boy knew how it was going to turn out, in this case, turning out to be this 32-year-old Rocky, how happy do you think that boy would be about that?
So happy.
I don't know, because this scene, this is in the beginning of the movie. The guy is down and out. He's really not got anything going on in his life. That's what made the whole scene so powerful. It's in the beginning of the movie, and he looks at himself, and I thought to myself, I wonder if I was to go back to that little boy that was me, and it's seeing me thinking, this is how I'm going to turn out, would it be happy about that?
Right.
And if you could actually inquire yourself at this moment where you are to maybe ask that question with that little girl that was so full of maybe, we're hoping that things are good, when you're a little girl or a little boy, that was so full of optimism and dreams, was to take a look at how they were about to turn out, no matter what your age is, in my case, beyond 50, would they be happy about or be excited about their future? That becomes a very powerful shift right there, for people, I would think.
Definitely. And, I don't mean to sound like Pollyanna, like, oh, everything's going to be okay. Because for many of us, we're in challenging situations and they're not going away. They're still here. But this is where we can really benefit from practicing getting into the present moment, that we can reconnect with ourselves in this present moment regardless of the circumstances that we're in or that the things that are happening around us. So I think part of what can trip us up is that, oh, you know, if I knew then I was going to be here in this really crappy situation, I just would not feel good about that at all. So what do you have power over? What can you change in this moment? There might not be a lot that you can change depending on what the situation is, but you always have that capacity to choose how you're going to see it in this moment. This is Viktor Frankl wrote Man's Search for Meaning. He was in a concentration camp, and he realized even when everything was taken away from him, he still had the power to choose in any given moment, you know, how he was going to see something. And so we have that choice now, and practicing getting into the present, being in this moment, even just feeling your beautiful feet on the floor, there is a grace and a joy that we can get from the little things like we appreciated when we were young. You know, we can appreciate the leaves coming out as they start to bud in the spring. Or I'm on the East Coast. We've got about a foot of snow on the ground right now. And as it's melting, we're going to start to see the crocuses and the daffodils pop up. It's those little joys that we can then use to help us reconnect with who it is that we truly are, regardless of the challenges that we are facing.
And I think you have a very wonderful way of sharing with our listeners that the more you tend to look for those things, like you're talking about the daffodils, those, you know, miracles, those beauties in life, the more you begin seeing them show up. And it's kind of crazy, really, when you think about it. What you focus on actually manifests itself. So the question is, what are you manifesting on? And, in fact, I recently got to know a young woman, and I think she was probably like around 23 years old. And just looking at her face and what comes out of her mouth and the way she holds herself, I thought, you know, this person is much too young to be having such a cynical attitude toward life. You know, we all take hits. The question is what you do about it. And you certainly don't let it drag you down as you're a victim and there's nothing you can do about it. I just wanted so much to reach out to her and have her do a little inquiry and say, you know, you can change this. You know, this doesn't have to be the sum of who you are. But I thought to myself, I could do that, but she didn't ask.
Right.
So this is her journey.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, we all need to be ready. And unsolicited advice, as well-intentioned as it may be, can often, you know, it's not received as the gift in which it's offered. It's not received in the spirit, you know, in which it was originally given. So we all have to be in that place of being open and asking for help. Yeah.
Yeah, when you ask or when you're ready, the teacher does arrive, and that's so totally true.
Definitely, I agree.
Corinne, for a lot of you out there, has just arrived. The question is, what have you decided to do with your next step? And that next step could be going to your website where they can find out more about your book, From Anxiety to Love. Tell us about that.
The website is filled with resources. I have a free crash course in Undoing Anxiety with A Course in Miracles. It's a 3-part video series. You can get information on the book through my website. I'll have upcoming classes specifically about the book. I have a 2-session class coming up and a 6-week class coming up. I facilitate A Course in Miracles study group every Sunday night. That's totally free, and folks call in from all over the world. And, of course, you can find links to connect with me on social media as well. So I have From Anxiety to Love podcast, video blogs, and a lot of written blogs as well. So there's a lot of content to support you on your journey.
And that website is what?
FromAnxietyToLove.com.
Very good. Corinne, thank you so much for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. You can also discover more at Beyond50Radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter and keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.